Hey guys, I'm Philip Molina, and this is a breakdown of Game of Thrones Season 6, Episode 5, The Door. And it's the saddest door ever, and it is like, I wish none of this had happened, and I feel bad for getting everybody so excited about this episode, and then this is what I made you guys have to deal with, and I'm all torn up about Hodor right now, and in fact, I feel terrible for a number of reasons, so I don't totally have it in me this second to do this breakdown. I'm just feeling so terrible, but I got my friend to come in, Erik. Hey, Erik.
Hey, everyone.
Okay.
You're shoving in.
You don't have to push me. I don't feel well enough to do this, but we had a big conversation about it. Erik is as big a fan of Game of Thrones as I am. He's read all the books, knows everything I would have said about this anyway. Be nice to him, he's so delicate. See?
I'm bruising.
And he's just gonna take over just talking about this episode for me as I leave and try to get better. But tweet at me, bye.
Hey guys, let's just all pray and send Philip our warm thoughts so that he can get better. I'm real torn up just like you are. My mind is blown, my heart is broken. I feel so bad about Hodor. I'm here with you. We're gonna break down everything in this episode, all the details you might have missed. Plus,
Wait, you need that.
This is ice cold. Philip is the Night King. But no, we're gonna go through this together. I got a couple predictions and theories for what's coming up in upcoming episodes. But anyway, let's get right started with the opening images.
So we see this close-up of Sansa sewing leather into wolf fur. Now the last video pointed out that Sansa is returning to her old Stark roots, and sewing was a big part of her life back in season 1. But also by fusing together the wolf fur with this tough leather, it's almost like Sansa's mending the severed ties between the Starks and the tough, unyielding northern families. Now check out this wax mockingbird seal on the letter from Littlefinger. That's the seal of the House Baelish. And notice how it's this reddish, pinkish color. That's actually the same color on the wax seal that was on the pink letter that we saw last episode. The reason I point that out is if you watch our last video, we kind of break down the color of the wax on the pink letter and how it's interesting that it's this reddish, pinkish color when normally, in the past, Ramsay has used this yellow wax to seal his letters. So I think it's interesting that even though we were left on this kind of uncertain place on who wrote the pink letter, right away this episode begins with this red sigil from a letter that Littlefinger wrote. So even though it's not totally confirmed, I feel like it's becoming a little more likely that Littlefinger could be behind this letter. We move on to this meetup in Molestown between Sansa and Littlefinger. Now, if you remember, Molestown was this village near the wall that was raided by the wildlings back in season 4, and that's why it's all in ruins now. But notice how Littlefinger is totally caught off guard in this scene. This is the most uncomfortable we've ever seen him. Sansa calls him out with this icy guilt trip for marrying her to this abusive monster Ramsay, and Littlefinger tries to defend himself by saying,
I made a mistake. A horrible mistake. I underestimated a stranger.
Now, if you remember in our last episode, we pointed out how the title of the episode, The Book of the Stranger, was referring to these parables that master manipulators like the High Sparrow and Littlefinger used to try to manipulate people. But it's totally not working here. Sansa isn't buying it. This scene just stretches on for what feels like a lifetime for Littlefinger, and the editing is just like forcing him to listen to her. And even if you see this perspective shot from Brienne's sword, you can see that he's totally feeling like he could die in this moment. Now, quickly, I want to point out a couple things about this conversation. So Littlefinger mentions BRYNDEN BLACKFISH. That's Catelyn's uncle, whom we haven't really seen since the Red Wedding. And I don't know if we can totally trust Littlefinger here, but if he is telling the truth, the show could finally be picking up those loose threads with the Tully family. And if that's true, we might even see Catelyn's brother Edmure too. Hope the honeymoon's been going well. Also, if you were wondering why Littlefinger corrects himself,
Your brother's only half-brother.
this is just Littlefinger reminding Sansa that it's not going to be easy to rally all the Stark bannermen to a bastard like Jon Snow, who's not a true-born Stark. Okay, moving on to Arya in the Waif sparring in the House of Black and White. We get this parallel weapon perspective shot of the bow staff, like the Waif is threatening Arya just like Brienne was threatening Littlefinger back in Molestown. The Waif ends this fight by saying,
You'll never be one of us, Lady Stark.
We've been saying before that this is going to be the year of the Stark, and as much as it seems like Arya is leaving her family behind, her training with the Faceless Men keeps reminding her of where she came from. Then Jack and Nagara explains the interesting origin story of the Faceless Men.
They began as slaves in the mines of Valyria. Soon all the masters and overseers were gone, and the Faceless Men fled. They founded the free city of Bravos and built this house.
And this actually happens throughout the episode, these characters opening up doorways to the past. This comes up a lot and I'll point it out every time it happens. And right away we get another door to the past with Arya watching this play in Braavos. And remember, she's reliving the exact moment that she witnessed back in season 1, her father's execution at Baelor. She's even perched higher than the rest of the crowd to get a good look, just like she was back in that scene. But notice how she's learning that her perception of what went down isn't at all what the rest of the world saw. Arya saw her father as noble to a fault, and she saw Cersei and Joffrey as evil psychopaths. But the world has simpler takes on all these characters. Ned, to the rest of the world, is a gullible idiot, and Joffrey is a mama's boy, and Cersei is an overprotective mom. And it's interesting that everyone assumes Tyrion is behind all the events that happen. So urging Ned to take the throne? Nope, that was actually Littlefinger. Betraying Ned with the dagger to his throat? Also Littlefinger. Paying off Ilyn Payne to execute Ned? No, that was just Joffrey being a dick. And while all this was happening, Tyrion wasn't even in King's Landing. But the point of all this is that the truth doesn't matter in this world. All that matters is whatever's the easiest story to sell. I'll touch on this again later. It's also interesting that after being forced to forget about her bucket list by Jaqen and the Waif,
Joffrey, Cersei, Walder Frey, Meryn Trant, Tywin Lannister, the Red Woman.
Arya is presented with this opportunity to kill the actress Lady Crane. She plays Cersei, the person who's at the top of Arya's bucket list. Here's why I don't think that's a coincidence. The idea of a play within a play goes back to Shakespeare, when Hamlet stages a mock play about the recent succession to the throne as a test to see how someone in the audience reacts. I think that's exactly what Jaqen is doing here. He's making Arya watch this false narrative, hoping to draw the truth out of her. Can Arya complete the mission without her past loyalties distracting her? Or will she always be Lady Stark? And maybe it's just the theater nerd inside of me, but there are all kinds of Shakespeare connections in this scene. The actors speak in rhyme couplets.
Who will teach him grace? To whom will he turn when it's time to learn to look darkness in the face?
There's this broad slapstick humor, there's live musicians playing in the balconies. It all feels like this entire set design was inspired by Shakespeare's Globe Theatre in London. And by the way, those musicians playing up in the balcony, that's the band of Monsters and Men. And I'm sorry about all these Shakespeare references, I'm gonna move on in a second, I promise, but this whole section reminds me of another famous Shakespeare quote.
All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts.
So this is one of his most famous extended metaphors, and it refers to the idea that life is just one great performance. Arya is witnessing the events of her life as a literal performance. And also I want to point out that that quote ends with, "The last scene of all is mere oblivion." To me, that sounds a lot like All Men Must Die. And the last thing I want to point out about this sequence is right after we see the Sansa actress's bare breasts, we get a shocking cut to something that we obviously can't show here, but it's interesting that along with Sansa's angry speech about what Ramsay did to her, this show seems to be taking a more balanced approach to sex and nudity. I'm sure Emilia Clarke is happy about that.
Yes, free the penis. That's your big cause? Free the penis?
Okay, let's move on to Bran's imagery-loaded vision. So right away, the visuals are establishing a connection between the Children of the Forest and the White Walkers, with these Stonehenge-like rocks formed in a spiral pattern. Remember, back in season 3, the White Walkers assembled all the dead horse parts in the same kind of spiral. So it seems like they're doing this as a reference to their place of origin. And this transformation scene reminded me of that season 4 scene in another Stonehenge ring when the Night King transformed the human baby into a White Walker. This event is the creation of the first White Walker, maybe even the Night King. I don't know, don't hold me to that. Whoever it is, it's the first White Walker. Notice how Leaf is stabbing this guy with the blade, and that's obsidian. Remember, dragon glass. It's one of the few things that White Walkers are vulnerable to, and now it seems like we understand why. But I'm wondering, who is this guy? It's not totally clear, but he must be special in some kind of way if the blade that is sticking in his chest doesn't kill him. He could be a green seer like Bran or the Three-Eyed Raven, or maybe he just has some powers in some other kind, or maybe he's just a random dude. I don't know. So Leaf kinda goes into why they're doing this in the next scene, but here's a little background from the books. So 10,000 years ago or so, there was a war between the First Men and the Children of the Forest. The war dragged on for centuries, and it led to some big disastrous events, like the Children of the Forest shattering the land bridge between Westeros and Essos. It totally changed the geography of this world. They also invented these white weapons of mass destruction, and I'll get to the worldly implications of that a little later. But this is interesting, because we're now learning that the White Walkers aren't exactly the evil incarnate that we used to think. Sure, they want to kill all men and turn their bodies into whites, and they steal our babies, so that's pretty evil, obviously. But they didn't always exist. They aren't the otherworldly evil that's playing the constant cosmic chess game with the Lord of Light or something like that. They're more like the Sentinels of X-Men or the Terminators in the Terminator movies. They were created, became sentient, and went far beyond what their intended purpose was. So they're evil in that way, but they're not totally indestructible. The other thing I want to point out about this scene is this face carved into the weirwood tree. Now, all the weirwood trees have faces carved into them. That was something that the Children of the Forest did during the pact that they made back in that war with men that I mentioned before. But this face in particular looks so much like the Three-Eyed Raven. It's like they modeled the carvings off of Max von Sydow's face. You even have these roots that are binding across the trunk of the tree that look like the roots that are entangled with the Three-Eyed Raven. So I feel like this is the show again underlining the fact that the Three-Eyed Raven is the weirwood tree. He's all the weirwood trees. He's someone who has connection to all of history. He can see everything, he knows everything. He's just the form of the weirwood trees that's taken a human form. Okay, then we move on to this Kingsmoot election in the Iron Islands. And notice how Yara wants to be the first female leader of a male-driven society. And just like another real-world woman running for office against a guy who loves talking about his big dick, this election kind of plays out the same way.
He referred to my hands. If they're small, something else must be small. I guarantee you there's no problem.
And I'm going to gallivant right over and give it to Daenerys Targaryen along with my big cock.
And I know before I was talking about doors to the past. We saw Bran go through a door to the past to see the creation of the first White Walker. This scene, we see a different kind of door, the door between life and death. When Euron Greyjoy gets baptized, his brother Damphair drags him into the water and forces him to actually drown. Now, we haven't seen this on the show before, but this is actually how people in the Iron Islands baptize people. They pay tribute to the drowned god by forcing their head under the water and killing them for a second. But he comes back and he rises again harder and stronger. And those are actually the exact words of the Ironborn. And notice how Euron's first move is to murder his niece and nephew.
Let's go murder them.
Yara made the same threat.
Now I know what my first act as queen will be. To execute the man who killed my father.
So it's interesting how in Game of Thrones, no one ascends to a throne without bloodshed. You have to kill the person currently on the throne and anyone else who could possibly claim it. Otherwise, your rule is never secure. That's why Robert Baratheon wanted to kill all the living Targaryens and why Cersei had all of Robert's bastard children murdered. I should point out that in the books, the storyline to join forces with Dany and Meereen is actually led by a different Greyjoy brother who doesn't look like he's going to be in the show. His name's Victarion. That's kind of a bummer that he's not going to be in the show because he's really a great character, but I think the show might be splitting up the best parts of his storyline to Yara and Theon, and another character that I'll talk about in a bit. But the last shot of Euron as he stands before the sea separating him and Dany immediately cuts to a shot of Dany as she looks over the drained Dothraki Sea. Clearly, the editing is bringing these two characters together.
Across the sea, there is a person who hates the great lords of Westeros just as much as we do. And together we're going to take the Seven Kingdoms.
So we get this emotional farewell between Daenerys and Jorah, and Daenerys commands him
to heal yourself.
Jorah's grayscale is another door between life and death. Clearly, it's a mark of death, and we've seen what happens to other people who get grayscale. But remember, we've seen at least one other character survive grayscale, Shireen, Stannis' daughter. She was afflicted with the disease as an infant, and Stannis brought in healers from both sides of the Narrow Sea to stop the spread, and they succeeded. But the grayscale permanently scarred her face. But the fact that the show could be pointing that he's off on this search for a cure means that he could have a full life ahead of him. And actually, before we move on, there's another theory I have for Jorah's grayscale. I'll admit it's a bit of a stretch, but it does connect to that Victarion Greyjoy character that I talked about before. There's a part of Victarion's story in the books where his hand gets wounded in battle, and a red priest uses magic to make it charred and blackened, and it stops the infection, but it makes his arm stronger than it ever was before. So if part of Jorah's search for a cure involves a red priest, it would be cool to see his grayscale turning his ashy arm into this super Winter Soldier arm. I don't know if that's gonna be the case, but we'll see. It'll be fun. Okay, moving on. So remember before I talked about Tyrion being the victim of the easiest story to sell, and now we see Tyrion selling his own not really true narrative that Daenerys is responsible for the peace in Meereen. And I think it's interesting that when Varys asked who his PR person will be, Tyrion responds with a callback to Varys' line last season.
Who said anything about him?
Now this high priestess KINVARA is basically the head of the Lord of Light religion. She has all these titles and she definitely outranks Melisandre. Melisandre. But notice how she's wearing the same kind of necklace Melisandre wears. We've seen other Red Priestesses who don't wear that necklace, so I wonder if this High Priestess is concealing old age, just like Melisandre was. It's also interesting that Tyrion would consider putting a religious fanatic in a position of power in Meereen. Remember, Cersei did the same thing in King's Landing with the High Sparrow, and we saw how well that worked out for her. I wonder if Tyrion will end up regretting this decision. Hopefully he won't have to do a walk of shame. He might enjoy that. I don't know. But the blocking of this scene already hints that Tyrion might be feeling overwhelmed. Last episode, when Tyrion placated the men of Meereen, he drove the conversation and he walked down the steps to come to their level. He showed no fear. But now he stays far away from Kinvara at the top of the steps, letting her and Varys duke it out while he hides behind Varys. Kinvara then rises up the steps to meet him. This kind of shows her rise to power already. And when Kinvara tells Varys about his abuse as a child, she accomplishes two things. One, she totally freaks him out because I'm pretty sure he's like, hey Tyrion, I only told you about that, so how is she reading my mind right now? This is totally freaking me out. And it's interesting that we see another master manipulator, just like Littlefinger, totally look unnerved. Like, these two guys are arguably the cleverest people in this show and nothing really surprises them, but in this episode, both of them look like, oh, shit, you got a point there. I don't know what to say. I should also point out that this whole scene is another example of a scene opening a door to the past, with a link to another mysterious character's origin, Varys. Before I move on, I want to talk about this disagreement between Red Priestesses. Kinvara believes that the prince that was promised is Daenerys Targaryen, but remember, Melisandre believes it's Jon Snow. They both point to miracles as evidence. Daenerys was the unburnt mother of dragons, and Jon came back from the dead after prayer to the Lord of Light. And we predicted last video that this could lead to a conflict between Dany and Jon to see which of them is the true prince that was promised. Like, they might have to duke it out. And I think that could still happen. All right, moving on. Okay, we return to the cave of the Three-Eyed Raven, and we get this shot of the dirt slipping through Bran's fingers. And I feel like this could be foreshadowing the sands of time that are running out for Bran. Now, he doesn't know it yet, but his time in this place is totally running out, and his decision to go into the vision alone is what triggers that countdown. But notice how the Three-Eyed Raven is sleeping and doesn't stir awake when Bran pegs him with the rock. I feel like he's letting Bran do this. Like, he knows there's a reason this has to happen to Bran, but that's a theory that I'll get to later. So in his vision, Bran returns to the same weirwood tree where we saw the Children of the Forest, where they created the White Walker. You can see the same overhead spiral pattern as before, except now we're thousands of years later in the present day. And this place has gone from a colorful world of greens and reds to this dead, snowy graveyard filled with an army of corpses. Now, this is important. The fact that the White Walkers are here means that this is way north of the Wall, and this land is supposed to be under constant winter, but thousands of years earlier, the place looked like it was in the middle of summer. So how is this possible? Our theory is that this could mean that by inventing the White Walkers, the Children of the Forest invented winter, the season itself. So from the very beginning of the show, we've assumed that winter is coming means that White Walkers are coming, but maybe it's the other way around, and the magic that created the White Walkers is the same magic that created the climate of Westeros that we know it to be today. But anyway, this mark that the Night King gives Bran works like a homing beacon. He's giving his position away to the enemy, from their home base, Weirwood Tree, to the other great Weirwood Tree, the home base for the Children of the Forest and the Three-Eyed Raven. So like the grayscale on Jorah's arm, this mark on Bran's arm is kind of a mark of death. But if Bran is just in a vision and he's supposed to only be looking at things, how can the Night King see and touch him? Well, what we're learning here and what Bran's understanding is that these visions aren't just normal visions. They're doors that you can pass through and physically interact with things on the other side. So that's what Bran's doing here. Just like we almost saw him do with his father at the Tower of Joy, which we actually have another theory about. I'll get to that later. Bran here is interacting with things in the past, and he can change things, or he already has changed things. So if you're like me, you were wondering, if the clock is ticking right now and Night Walkers are on their way to kill them all, why does the Three-Eyed Raven take Bran into another vision instead of just getting the hell out of there? Well, there might be a couple reasons why. He could be just expediting Bran's training, giving him a last-minute crash course and being a wise old tree man. But I think the Three-Eyed Raven is also carefully following a plan. He needs Bran to revisit this specific moment of time. But again, I'll get to that more later. And we move on to this scene with Ser Davos and Jon Snow and Sansa strategizing with this big war map of the North. And we've seen maps like this before with Robb Stark brooding over the Boltons and the Umbers and the Karstarks. Remember back in season 3, Robb Stark spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to keep his Northern Alliance together, even though it was kind of breaking apart after he beheaded Lord Karstark. Karstark family just totally split away, and now we see that Robb's sister Sansa and his half-brother Jon are having to clean up the mess that he left, planning over another one of these big maps and trying to put the pieces back together. So a lot of people are wondering why Sansa lies to Sir Davos and Jon about how she found out about the Blackfish retaking Riverrun. The reason why, I think, is that she doesn't want to admit that Littlefinger met with her and offered her the help of the Knights of the Vale. Sansa wants to take back Winterfell, but she doesn't trust Littlefinger. She wants to do it without his help. She wants to go reassemble all the Stark bannermen without having to trust this person who basically sold her into slavery. But what's ironic about this is that Sansa's hate for Littlefinger causes her to do exactly what Littlefinger would do, lie in the situation and cover up the truth. And then we see Sansa taking another page from Littlefinger's playbook, disguising manipulation in the form of a gift. Now we go back to our opening images and we see what we saw her sewing in those opening shots, a wolfskin cloak with the Stark sigil. Now this gift to Jon Snow has two purposes. One, Sansa knows that Jon's only a Stark bastard, so practically speaking, he'll have to look as much like Ned Stark as possible to get the northern houses to rally to their cause. But also, Sansa wants Jon to actually embrace his inner Stark and reconnect with his roots, just like we've seen her doing.
I like the wolf bit.
The only thing I want to point out about this shot of everyone leaving the wall, other than this big flirty smile between the bear and his maidenfair, is Jon's goodbye to Ed. He says,
"Don't knock it down while I'm gone."
Now, this seems like a throwaway line, but it could be a bigger deal than it seems. Remember, the mark on Bran's arm allows the Night King and the other White Walkers to cross magic barriers. The wall was built 8,000 years ago by Bran's namesake, Bran the Builder, to defend the realm from White Walkers, and there's supposedly magic in the wall to keep White Walkers out. But if Bran ever goes south of the wall, that could totally nullify the magic that protects it, and it could end up with the amazing image of this thing totally collapsing. I don't know if that's going to be the case. It would be an awesome spectacle, but I'll get back to some wall theories a little later. Moving on. Okay, so for this amazing final sequence, so much is going on, and just in case any of you were thinking, what the hell am I seeing right now, I'm gonna do my best to break all of it down and what I think is going on. So Bran and the Three-Eyed Raven are in this vision at Winterfell, and it's the day young Ned Stark leaves for the Vale to begin his wardship under Jon Arryn. And while they're under, the White Walkers show up, led to them by Bran's mark. Meera tries to escape, but Hodor panics and he can't help her, so Meera remembers the times Bran has warged into Hodor's mind, and she screams down to Bran in the vision to do the same thing right now.
We need Hodor!
Hodor!
Bran, we're all gonna die!
So what Bran does is warg into Willis. Remember, Willis is Hodor as a young boy. And when he connects to Willis's mind, that connects to Hodor's mind in the future. And so through Willis, Bran is controlling Hodor like a puppet to save them. So once they get outside, Meera shouts down to Bran in the vision to make Hodor
Hold the door!
so they can escape. Meera starts to drag Bran away, and just like a bad satellite connection, the signal begins to affect Willis's brain. His mind is fused with his future self. So think about this. One minute, Willis is just this happy kid working in Winterfell, and the next, his consciousness just flips to his old self, being chased by these corpses as his body is out of his control, and then he has to hold a door while he gets clawed and stabbed by all these corpses. He literally experiences the pain of his own death, and it's so traumatic and trippy that it puts him in this state of shock, and he convulses on the ground and he screams the last words he hears before his mind is totally fried. Hold the door, hold the door, hold the door, Hodor. This might be the most heartbreaking reveal we've ever seen on the show. Basically, Hodor spends his entire adult life being mocked just so he can one day sacrifice himself to save Bran. So it's hard to watch his death without tearing up. It's also pretty dark because Hodor isn't consciously sacrificing himself to save Bran and Meera. Bran and Meera are making him do it. They're forcing their friend to kill himself. So this is a pretty mind-blowing reveal, right? George R.R. Martin has supposedly been sitting on it for decades. Apparently he came up with the idea in 1991. That's 5 years before the first book came out. George R.R. Martin has said in an interview that he wishes he was a faster writer and he's depressed that the show got to the reveal before the books did, but he still plans to keep Hold the Door as the reason Hodor's name is Hodor, but he still is going to introduce it in a very different way, so you have a reason to read the books if you weren't going to do it already. But also Also, fun fact, someone shared an elevator with George R. R. Martin in 2013 and joked that Hodor's name might come from Hold the Door, and Martin joked, "You don't know how close to the truth you are." So George R. R. Martin is a pretty crazy, brilliant mastermind who's been sitting on this specific turn of phrase for a long time. Whenever I have a pun, I have to say it immediately. So I'm gonna dig into these closing images more in a bit, but first I wanna try to explain the time travel logic that Game of Thrones is using here. So Philip kind of went into this in a previous video talking about the third Harry Potter movie and how time is all part of one giant timeline rather than other theories of time travel that we've seen like in Back to the Future, where meddling in the past causes different timelines to form or changes the timeline in some way. Game of Thrones doesn't look like it's doing that right now. In this version of time travel, there's only one fixed timeline, and every decision and every cause and effect is all predestined. Even the decision to go back in time and affect something, it's all part of the big plan. This is called a causal loop, also called a self-fulfilling prophecy. Think of it as a train track that has been redirected to loop back to an earlier part of the track. This loop is still part of the big train track of destiny. So when you think about it that way, Bran started his life on this train with a simple-minded guy named Hodor, who says Hodor for some reason. And it's not until they're further down the track that Bran goes on that loop, realizing that he was always the reason Hodor is the way he is. It wasn't Bran's decision to change that track, he was just along for the ride. Now, I know this is super confusing, and to be honest, I don't fully understand it, and a lot of you guys are asking, if the Three-Eyed Raven knew all of this was going to happen, why would he even let Bran go into a vision where the Night King would mark him? And why would he just not let Bran wake up from this vision and warg into adult Hodor so he doesn't ruin Hodor's brain as a kid? This self-fulfilling prophecy of time travel kind of explains why. The Three-Eyed Raven can't alter the track. He's kind of like the train conductor. He knows what the stops are. It's his job to make sure Bran gets where he needs to be. Specifically, Bran needs to be with young Willis on the day he loses his mind, because that's all part of destiny.
Listen to your friend, Brandon.
So the question isn't what else will Bran change, it's what else has Bran already changed, right? So there's a theory out there that Bran could be the reason that the Mad King went mad to begin with, or Bran was the voice Arya heard back in the first book when she killed the stable boy in King's Landing, or that Bran could be Bran the Builder himself. In fact, one part of the books mentions a small boy told the men and the children of the forest how to build the wall, and that boy grew up to be Bran the Builder. Though if Bran time travel is behind all of the big historical events of Westeros, it kind of takes some of the fun out of the world that George R. R. Martin created, so I kind of hope that they limit the amount of times that Bran could have affected things. But there is one Bran theory based off of what we've already seen that's got me thinking. Let's take another look at that Tower of Joy moment I referenced earlier. I wonder when Bran shouted, "Father!" at Ned Stark, he gave Ned Stark the idea to pretend to be the father to the baby that he finds up in the tower, probably Jon Snow. Now, it's just a theory, don't quote me on it, but it's definitely true. It's just a theory, probably true. Now, I've been talking a lot about the specifics of time travel and what's happening when Bran is warging into Willis, into Hodor, but there's a lot that's happening in the sequence. It's all so intense and well directed, and there's a bunch of other details I want to point out. First, Hodor's not the only person who dies to save Bran. Pretty much everyone does. Leaf uses this holy hand grenade to blow herself up in the tunnel, and the Three-Eyed Raven pulls an Obi-Wan Kenobi, letting the Night King strike him down, hopefully to become more powerful than ever before. And most sadly, we say goodbye to another direwolf. Ugh, Summer. 4 out of the 6 Stark direwolves are now dead, leaving only Ghost and Nymeria alive. But unlike the others, Summer at least goes out fighting. Also, Summer's name seems important here, right? Like, the death of Summer means the beginning of winter, and the Starks are more prepared for winter than any other family. So Summer's death could just be another natural step in the year of Stark. Either way, R.I.P. Summer. We hardly knew ye. Also, I know some of you guys were wondering about the White Walkers and the Whites and why some of them could pass through the fire while others couldn't. Now remember, White Walkers are the supernatural beings that were created by the Children of the Forest with obsidian, dragon glass. So while obsidian can kill them, along with Valyrian steel, they're totally cool with fire. Whites are the zombie-like corpses that they control. Obsidian and Valyrian steel can cut them up, but fire is really the only true way you can destroy them. But the bigger question I have is, how will these creatures deal with dragon fire? I don't know if dragon dragon glass is created maybe by dragonfire, and if dragons are making their way to Westeros, it'd be interesting to see these two supernatural beings show down against each other. We'll see. But let's get back to these closing images. Remember, this episode is called The Door, which is obviously a reference to Hodor holding the door in the final moments. But Hodor isn't just holding a literal door, he's holding a door open to the past. This episode checks in with a lot of characters, but at the center of it are three of the Stark children, Sansa, Arya, and Bran. And each of them walk through portals in time to re-examine traumatic experiences that they need to learn from. Sansa's door brings her back to Ramsay's cruelty, but she learns the strength to stand up to another man who treated her like an object, Littlefinger. Arya's door takes her back to the moment that started her journey, the execution of her father at Baelor. But she learns that the version of events that she experienced isn't the same truth that the rest of the world believes. And of course, Bran's door shows how he caused his friend's psychotic breakdown and death, but he needs his experience to learn that he has the power to influence past events, or he has already influenced past events. Hodor is a tragic figure, and the big reveal coming at the moment of his death is such a gut punch, but his death serves a greater purpose. He saves Bran while simultaneously allowing him to understand an important part of his powers. And Hodor does this all in the simple act of holding the door.
Hold the door!
Okay, so here's the part where Philip wants me to take a look at the preview for the next episode and make some predictions. So next episode is called Blood of My Blood, and just in case any of these predictions end up being right, they could be pretty big spoilers, so skip past this part if you don't want to know anything. Okay, here we go. So we see a few shots of Bran and Meera alone in the woods, freaking out as the Whites are closing in on them. And a few of you guys are wondering where episode 5 left these two. Like, they aren't exactly safe at all. They've lost Summer the Direwolf and Hodor and those badass children of the forest with their awesome grenades, so who's gonna protect them now? They obviously need help. Well, I have a theory on this. The trailer for season 6 showed a quick shot of someone that I'm pretty sure is an awesome character from the books. His name is Cold Hands. Cold Hands is a mysterious masked figure who's part white, maybe, part ex-brother of the Night's Watch, maybe. He rides this awesome massive elk, and somehow he's kind of a good guy. He saves Sam in book 3, and later on in book 5, he's the one who guides Bran to the Three-Eyed Raven. So I have a feeling that the show's gonna bring him and Bran together next episode. Maybe, hopefully. And again, this is a possible spoiler, but there is a popular fan theory that Cold Hands is actually the missing Benjen Stark. Remember, if we go back to Bran's vision, there was this long shot of young Benjen Stark back in the flashback as Ned Stark hugged him goodbye. So the show is reminding us of Benjen for a reason. Also, George R.R. Martin has denied the rumors that Benjen is Cold Hands, but either way, I feel like we're gonna see Benjen come back in some form at some point this season. We also see some shots of Sam and Gilly at the Tarly home city of Hornhill, as well as this guy, Lord Randall Tarly. Now, a little history on Randall. He fought on the losing side of Robert's rebellion, but he actually forced Robert's army to retreat at the Battle of Ashford. But Robert ended up winning the war anyway, leaving Randall to become this surly asshole that his son Sam has described him as. I feel like he's not gonna be cool with Sam keeping a wildling under his roof. We'll see how long they last there. There's also this footage of the big showdown between the Tyrells and the Faith Militant in King's Landing. Now, our previous videos predicted that this might not go exactly as Jaime and Cersei proposed that it would, but by the look of Jaime's upset reaction, I feel like this is going to blow up in their faces. Remember, the High Sparrow is a master manipulator. He always has an ace up his sleeve, and I feel like this isn't gonna turn out well for the Lannisters. So finally, we get this interesting shot of Daenerys leading the Dothraki through these dusty desert hills. Now, this reminds me of that sun rising in the west promise that Daenerys always comes back to. Part of that phrase is,
when the seas go dry, when the mountains blow in the wind like leaves.
Now, the dust blowing off of these mountains fits that description pretty well. Also, notice how Daario calls Daenerys a conqueror.
You're a conqueror, Daenerys Stormborn.
Now, I know this is probably a stretch, but every time I hear the term conqueror used to describe a Targaryen, I feel like it's gotta be a reference to Aegon the Conqueror. That's the first Targaryen to jump on a dragon and fly across the narrow sea to conquer Westeros and crown himself Lord of the Seven Kingdoms. Now, the reason I bring this up is we know Drogon is flying around somewhere. We haven't seen him at all this season. Let me know what you think about this. Okay, finally, let's get to our lingering questions. So what does this mean for Bran's power now? He's not connected to the Weirwood tree, but he's still kind of in this vision, in this trance. So does this mean he can see through time remotely? Just like how he can control animals remotely, when and wherever he wants? Also, that mark from the Night King that's on his arm, does that stay with him everywhere he goes? Is he always going to be on the run from now on? Is he just going to be constantly chased engulfed by this army of White Walkers? I don't know, that would be pretty terrifying. And also a pretty huge pain in the ass for Meera, who has to drag him everywhere. Also, do we think Sansa did the right thing by refusing Littlefinger's help and turning down the Knights of the Vale? I mean, they're a pretty massive army and they desperately need more men to take back Winterfell. Also, do you think she should have lied to Jon Snow and Sir Davos about it? I don't really know. It seems like it was something that she did out of pride, but she has a very valid reason to not trust Littlefinger. We'll just have to see if she has enough men on her side to not need his help. Okay, that's it. That's everything I got. Let me know what you think of all this in the comments. Thanks so much for watching these. Please go easy on me in the comments. It's the first time I've really done one of these, so I'm just trying to fill in and help Philip as he feels better and mends his broken heart. If you like this video, please share it around, and of course, like it and subscribe to New Rockstars for more videos. Also, make sure to check out our other episode breakdowns. Philip went into a lot of fan theories in those last ones, so if I didn't cover something here, Philip probably went over it in one of those other videos. You can follow us on Twitter at New Rockstars. You can hit up Philip with more questions on Twitter at Fimo, or you can follow him on Facebook.com/FimoKnows. All right, guys, thanks for watching. I'm Erik Voss. Bye.